Good morning. Today I'm going to be lecturing from the Black Box Theater of the Gertrude Krampert Center for the Performing Arts. And today I would like to talk to you about the second part of our discussion on script analysis. We have been looking at the analysis of the script from the perspective of theater practitioners, directors, actors, designers, and so forth. That was last week. But this week we're going to be looking at theater and script analysis from the perspective of the critic or the historian or the theoretician. Now, just so that we can clear up some of our terms here, all of this has to do with a scholarly approach to the study of the theater. And I offer my students this because I want people to understand that the theater is in itself a very fascinating object of study that doesn't necessarily require you to be a practitioner of the theater, a director or an actor, in order to work in the theater at this level. There are many scholars out there and researchers and historians who are doing very important work on this in these areas. And what they do is they respond to what the practitioners are doing, and they write historical analyses or critical analyses of these works. And then the practitioners will respond to what the critics and the historians are saying, and then the historians and the critics and the scholars will evaluate the new work of the practitioners. And so it goes on in this almost conversational cycle between the scholars and the practitioners. Myself, I'm interested in both things, and so I inhabit both worlds. And I find that my experience as a theater practitioner, as an actor, director, producer, playwright, has been very helpful to me as a scholar of the theater. I also noticed that when I went back to get my PhD in 2000 and took 10 years to do it, that what I learned and as a scholar and how I was trained to think as a scholar really helped to improve my work as a director and an actor. So I love inhabiting both of those worlds. I've written some peer-reviewed scholarship that has appeared in journals, professional peer-reviewed journals. And while this material could be very dry to people who are not in the field, it's nonetheless very informative and very rewarding to have access to this material and also to be able to understand what is happening and what the scholars and historians and the critics and the theoreticians are all saying. Okay, so having established that, then we talk about what each of these people do. The critic is the person who evaluates the execution of performances. So evaluates performances and or the execution of performances. How about that? So, and of course, by execution, we mean how it's done, not performances being killed. The execution of the performance means how well was it done, or first of all, a good critic should be just trying to explain to the reader how it was done. Hello, Riker. How it was done. And if you want to come in and sit down and listen to me talk about critical analysis, that's great. Sure. Yeah, I'm recording a Zoom lecture right now. So the critics are concerned with how it was done and also how well it was done. Now this is objective, this is subjective. Of course, how it was done would be plain to anybody who saw the work. How well was it done, though, is a matter of opinion. And sometimes critics get taken to task because they don't have the experience of performers often to make the evaluation. So theater artists and artists of every stripe have been at war with critics for millennia. But I think that we help each other out. The critic is also there to help consumers make decisions. Consumer decisions are based on what the critic is saying. People need to know, especially in the professional theater, whether a production is worth their time. And so in order to decide whether or not you want to go to something or whether it would appeal to you and whether it's worth spending your money, you pick up the newspaper or you click onto the newspaper nowadays and you find what the critic has said about the performance, and then you take it from there. Critics are also inadvertently recording history as it's being made. So when a critic goes to a production, he or she is sitting there and they're watching the show and they're writing down what they see and what happened. And then later on, these reviews, that's what critics produce, the reviews become valuable historical documents, because now future scholars and historians can go back, and as I often do, go back to the New York Times historical database, where I will find the reviews of whatever play I'm interested in. And that gives me a very good sense of the kind of cultural, intellectual, and social work that this play was doing. And all plays do work of that kind, of one kind or another, when it comes to its impact on people, on society, on the culture generally. And we want to make sure that we understand what these plays are doing, and the reviews are like snapshots in time of what's happening in the theater. Well, the historian writes history, but the historian is also not just somebody who is repeating or preserving the evidence of the past. History is not just written, it's rewritten. And as more evidence accrues about historical events, we find that we have to readjust our narrative of what happened. Certain aspects of history, of course, are indisputable. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. That's a matter of fact. That's not anybody's opinion. But certainly matters of broad fact like that don't just emerge spontaneously. Matters of broad fact like that have a basis, and they come from somewhere. And the results that we see, Napoleon loses at Waterloo, is usually the result of an elaborate, long-running process that brought us to this point, with lots of moving parts, and often not as simple as it seems. So as we historians, do the deep dive into what happened, or what we think happened, we often find that we need to reinterpret some evidence, or to reinterpret evidence in the light of new evidence that has emerged. So we're constantly retelling the story of the theater as our knowledge of the theater grows, as we find more artifacts from the ancient past and from the period where records were scanty at best. As we approach our own time in history, obviously the artifacts are better. Now, as we get to the 19th century, we start seeing photographs. First we start seeing lithographs, which are line drawings that could be easily reproduced in painting and in print. From lithographs to actual photographs of performances, to films and film clips of performances. And all of this was ways of documenting what was happening on stage. We don't have any of that before the 19th century. Before the 19th century, all we have are paintings and sketches and drawings of people in performance, and we have written literary accounts. And that's it. And the whole history of the theater has to be reproduced from this body of evidence and interpreted in that way. And what we arrive at is a general sense of what was going on, but still there's a lot of discussion inside of that umbrella of the general sense of how we got to where we are or were. So I find history fascinating for that reason. And the theoretician is looking at the why. If we wanted to make this simpler, critics are talking about how, and historians are talking about what, and theoreticians are talking about why. Often, though, this all flows back and forth into each other. These are not necessarily discrete categories in which there's a lot of separation. Historians do evaluate, critics do historicize, theoreticians also provide a lot of information about history, and theory comes from larger philosophical movements. And I'm going to show you what that was, what these are. When we talk about theater theory, we're talking about why people made theater and why they made it the way they did, and also what was the intended effect of this theater. So if you go back to ancient Greece, Why did they do theater? They were doing it to worship the god Dionysus and also to celebrate the power of the Athenian citizenry. The Athenians were the preeminent city-states of the ancient Greek world, and the festival of Dionysus was the exhibition of their power. Also, again, part of a religious festival, the worship of Dionysus, with the goal of producing in the audience the experience of catharsis, the release of pity and fear. Kind of like what you might experience if you go to a slasher film and you're seeing people get carved up and you feel pity and fear. But you know that you're not yourself going to be a victim of the mad killer because you're sitting safely in a movie and all of that is happening in flickering lights on a screen. Nevertheless, that doesn't make it any less affective on us. It doesn't make it any less personal and hitting us in the gut in terms of our emotions go. So the release of pity and fear was the object of Greek theater, or at least Greek tragedy. The object of Greek comedy was to critique the society around it and make mockery of the politicians and their policies and the silly wars that the Athenians were engaged in. So the theater in this perspective also becomes, the why of the theater from this perspective becomes a way for the people to express a lot of what they believe in politically, religiously, philosophically, and so forth. Okay, so the critical perspectives, or the theoretical perspectives, are as follows. I'm going to show you 4 of them. I'll take them in order. There's the feminist perspective. There is the Marxist perspective. There is the postcolonial perspective. And there is the queer perspective. Now, often theoreticians come from one of these, let's call them schools of thought. And these are all very broad categories. These are all lenses, if you will. These are lenses. You spell lenses? Yeah. Do you ever spell a word and it doesn't look right? No, I guess it's right. So these are all different perspectives. These are lenses through which a scholar will look in examining a performance. And so what the feminist perspective is doing is it is examining the representation of women in a cultural work. In this case, in the theater, we are examining the representation of women in the play. It's examining the representation of women. And this opens up very interesting questions like who is doing the representing of the women? For example, in Elizabethan England, women were not allowed to perform on stage. And so the first roles, the first great female roles written by Shakespeare were performed by boys in dresses. And what does this tell us about a society that bans women from the stage but puts boys in dresses? What is this telling us about the way women were viewed in this culture? If we look at a particular play or a particular performance of a play, such as A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, and I'd like you to keep these in mind because your midterm is going to be derived from your reading of one of these plays that I provide for you. Doll's House could be understood very well from a feminist perspective. This is about a woman who is in this marriage. It takes place in Norway. It was written originally in Norwegian. She's married to this guy, Torvald. He's a banker. Long story short, she's been blackmailed throughout the whole play, and along the way, she realizes that her husband is not the man that she thought he was, in terms of being the archetypal, protective, powerful male that was going to save the heroine, the damsel in distress. But in fact, what Nora realizes through the course of the play is that she doesn't need this man to protect her anymore, because he's weak, and he's really self-centered and very selfish. And at the end of the play, Nora leaves her family. She walks out the door, she slams the door, and never returns. In the 19th century, this play was written in 1879 and premiered in 1879. This play was considered shocking. And it was because the fear was that it was going to encourage women to rebel against their husbands and to seek life outside of the home. So the play was banned. Many critics and scholars say that when Nora slammed the door at the end of A Doll's House, it was the loudest sound that had yet been heard in the history of the theater. I asked that question on a quiz once, and a kid said, it was because Nora was really mad and she slammed the door with a lot of force. I gave the kid points anyway.
What about Lincoln getting shot?
Well, no, on stage though, you know, I mean, Lincoln getting shot at the Ford's Theater was, you know, loud also. I mean, the assassination of a president during a play is by an actor is a monumental moment, but that didn't happen in the context of theater. It happened in it. Well, it happened in a theater, but it wasn't. It was because he jumped down on the Booth, jumped down on the stage, and he yelled "Sic semper tyrannos," which means this is what happens to tyrants, loosely translated in Latin. But in any event, Nora leaves, she slams the door, and she doesn't come back because good Victorian housewives don't walk away from their husbands and their families. We also see in feminist analysis not only the representation of women, which for most of theater history was by men, both on stage and as the author of the scripts. We also see an exploration of the dynamic of the male and female relationship and the power struggle that sometimes occurs in these relationships. And depending on the time in history, women have more or less power. And plays, for example, ancient plays such as Lysistrata show women fully in control of a situation. In Lysistrata, the women go on a sex strike to stop the men from making war. It works. It's a comedy, by the way. And or in the play Hedda Gabler, which is also by Ibsen, another play which has a very, very strong female character that ultimately realizes that there's no place for her in the world for a woman like her. So there's a lot to think about, and sometimes plays, not sometimes, but often you can use the feminist perspective to analyze a play that you might not have thought would have a feminist perspective. Like, for example, let's go back to Death of a Salesman. We can look at Death of a Salesman from a feminist perspective because of, well, first of all, Linda. We could analyze the way in which the mother is responding to all of the stuff around her and how and why she's pretty much used as a doormat and is not really very effective in offsetting the bad influence that Willie has on his sons, because she herself is, in a way, emotionally abused. And so she represents, I think, one of my colleagues said that Linda is the heart and soul of that play. And from a feminist perspective, it kind of flips the script because the emphasis in the play is on all of these testosterone crazed jocks that are running around chasing women and cheating on their wives, and so we kind of forget that there's a feminine dimension to this play, and so we focus on the boys and all of their athleticism and all of their bullying and finally, ultimately, their failure. And also we see in the play the ways in which the men, especially Biff and Happy and Willie, treat women, what they think about them. And all of that could be directed toward a feminist, that's an example of looking through the play through a feminist lens. Are there any questions? Oh, of course not, this is a recording. Marxist perspective. Karl Marx was a 19th century historian, philosopher. His book was called The Communist Manifesto. And in it, he argues that the problem of history is that it's the problem of the haves versus the have-nots, basically. This is the have-nots. This group of haves, very small. This group of have-nots, very big. Marx says that the problem with history is that these people control, this small group of people controls most of the resources in the world. Let's see my screen there a little bit better, yeah. The haves are a small group of people, they control most of the resources on this planet. And they do it by passing on their wealth to their offspring, by becoming cronies and working together to ensure that they themselves are in control of the mechanisms of industry and in that way are able to enrich themselves. These various schemes in middle American capitalism of the 1900s, these were called monopolies and trusts. And Theodore Roosevelt broke them up. President Roosevelt broke up the trusts with the antitrust acts and the anti-monopoly acts. And it's becoming interesting now as these discussions are being brought to bear on social media giants like Google and, well, not social media, but Facebook and Twitter, for example. But in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says that we have to understand history in terms of this unequal distribution of wealth, the class struggle. Everything in history has to do with class, not race, not religion, but social class. The haves want to keep what they have. The have-nots want to get what they don't have. Marx says that the only solution for this is the forced redistribution of wealth. You have to force these people, you have to take from them basically what they have and distribute it equally and fairly among everybody else. And then everybody contributes to a society based on what their own talents are, based on what they can contribute. Marx's catchphrase is to each, from each, according to his ability, to each, according to his need. So from me, in a communist society, I teach. And I put on plays. Communists, actually, the one good thing I could say about communism was that it was very good for the theater in terms of creating possibilities for great theater artists to emerge in the Soviet Union, at least before Stalin put the kibosh on everything in the 1930s. But for a while there in the Soviet Union, there was a tremendous theatrical foment of energies that influenced theater around the world. But then by the time we get to the 1930s, 1940s, Stalin is just killing everybody and anybody he thought was a dissenter. And so the plays shifted completely into this what they called socialist realism. And the plays were all about this and trying to show the Soviet people how lucky they were to be living under communism, how evil the capitalists were, how evil the landlords and the bankers and the CEOs and the chairmen of corporations, all of these people, how bad they are. And how noble and heroic are the peasants, the farmers, the workers, the factory workers. And it's all basically propaganda. It's a good word for you to know. Propaganda is the practice of presenting one side of an argument with an emphasis on emotions. Propaganda does not appeal to reason. Propaganda appeals to the emotions. Propaganda's goal is to try to get you mad and to try to get you to take action either because you're pissed off or you're afraid. And again, propagandists do not present nuanced arguments in which all sides of an issue are subtly explored and tested. Propaganda is a bludgeon. It comes at you like a sledgehammer and it doesn't relent until you agree. And it's making the argument mostly by means of rhetorical force, repetition, and also the installation of fear and anger. Just look what's going on. So when you look at a play through a Marxist perspective, you're trying, again, to analyze what's being said about markets, capitalism, markets, workers, workplaces, employers, everything having to do with the business of business becomes subject to a Marxist analysis. And I think by now it should be pretty clear how Death of a Salesman lends itself to a Marxist analysis. In fact, Arthur Miller, the playwright, was not at all shy about his intentions here. In fact, it was mostly his intention to expose the evils of the capitalist system and to show that what American capitalism does to people like Willie Lowman. He's the low man. And it's tragic. Along the way, we see that this is also a study in dementia. We see on the stage a man who is clearly in psychological decline. And all of this, from Miller's perspective, has to do with the ruthlessness and the cruelty of the capitalist system. And so in showing the audience the ruthlessness and cruelty of the capitalist system, it's meant to get the audience to think in more favorable terms about socialism and communism. Because according to Miller and according to the theorists of socialism and communism, this would never have happened to Willie if he had lived under different conditions. if he had lived under a socialist or a communist state, he would have been a carpenter or something that really was an expression of who he really was. He would have lived a much better life. And the point of the analysis from this perspective is to show how this play is making the case for the evils of capitalism and how does it do it. And if you have any questions about any of this before Friday or even over the weekend, because I'm going to open the quiz on this on Friday and it will be open for you all weekend. If you have any questions in advance of the quiz or even over the weekend, just send me an email if there was something about this that you didn't understand or want me to clarify further. Postcolonial. This has to do with the idea of the other. The other. And especially the idea of the other as it is seen in the context of European colonialism. So to remind you of what European colonialism was, it was the major countries of Europe sailing around the world in boats and essentially colonizing, setting up colonies, and often by force, usually by force, subduing and subjugating local populations, installing European culture and European values, as happened in India. It's one of the reasons that India, I think, is the largest English-speaking country in the world, even though I think I think it's like the #3 language in India, but everybody in India speaks English, or practically everybody does. And there are so many Indian people that it makes it that there are more speakers of English in England than there are in America. What happens though when Europeans show up and they meet all these exotic people is that what gets constructed from this perspective is the idea of the other. Now keep in mind that when Shakespeare is writing a play like The Tempest, in which takes place on a tropical island, he's writing this based on the information that he's receiving from European travelers who had been sailing around the world and sending back the accounts of their adventures. And so Shakespeare is using this material to write The Tempest. And on that island, we see a lot of others, people who are very different. There's a character who's been living on the island. He's the offspring of a witch and a demon. His name is Caliban, although his name is actually an inversion of the word cannibal. This is how these native people were seen, barely human, questionably human, and possibly the offspring of demons, and of questionable value to the Europeans. We see it also in the play Othello by Shakespeare, in which a black man who is the general of the army of Venice, or the Navy of Venice, marries a white woman, and because his evil sidekick Iago poisons his mind with the notion that Othello's otherness is real. When you look at the play Othello, what we see is a construction from the European perspective of non-white Europeans, of African people. Othello is an African black, and he is described as such in the play. He is known as the Moor, this word here, M-O-O-R, from Monaco, from Moorish dances. And from the European perspective, the Moors were anybody that wasn't European. So the Moors could be Arab, the Moors could be African blacks, the Moors could even be Asian. But the Moors were everybody who were not European. And in this particular case, though, the Moors became more identified with Arabs and Arabic culture. So when this play was performed, when Othello was performed, it was usually performed, the role of Othello was performed by an actor in whiteface, or an actor in blackface, a white actor in blackface. I've seen 20th century productions in which the great Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, right? Hopkins played Othello in Arab face. Rather than trying to make him black, they turned him into an Arab sheik. And they gave him a very tan complexion, and he had a dark beard, and they dyed his hair black, and he looked like an Arab sheik. But when you look at the language of the play, you see that an Arab person is not being described here. And the racial insults that are levied against Othello by the evil characters in the play are all fundamentally directed toward racial animus, the racial animus of white Europeans towards African blacks. Now, it should be clear, and I want to make it clear, that Shakespeare is not a racist who's writing a play to make the point of the play is not to make people hate black people. Europeans hate black people. The point of the play is to show that Othello was a human being of the finest and highest caliber, someone who was indispensable to the Europeans who hired him to protect them from the Turks, also Moors. And this idea also in the play of the conflict or the clash between Islam and Christianity is a very powerful one, because that's who Othello was protecting the Christian Europeans from, the Moors. And so in a sense, he's on the side of the people who should be his enemy. But he's in love with this woman, she's in love with him, and it's a perfectly natural state of affairs certainly from our perspective and even from the perspective of people in that day. But that doesn't stop the play from circulating around the plot of Iago attempting to destroy this man by making him doubt his own humanity, by making him absorb and internalize all of this otherness, making him believe that he really is the animal, the brute, the savage, that the stereotypes create or insist that he be. And by the end of the play, Iago has so distorted and destroyed Othello's mind that he becomes the animal, the savage, and he murders his wife, whom Iago has convinced Othello that Desdemona, his wife, is sleeping literally with the army. That's how bad it gets by the end of the play. It starts out with one guy, and then as Othello slowly gets taken in under Iago's evil spell, Iago's able to convince him of anything, and so he's convinced that his wife is just as practically a prostitute. And so in a way, he others himself. Plays that represent this clash of culture, clashes of two cultures, will circulate around the post-colonial theme and can be analyzed from that perspective. There really isn't much that can be done with the post-colonial perspective in terms of Death of a Salesman. I'll give extra credit to anybody who can figure out a way, but it's not really coming to me right now. Queer theory, just to move on here, queer theory is another way of looking at art and culture. Now keep in mind, let me remind you that all of these perspectives are not limited to the theater. These perspectives can be applied to pretty much any cultural phenomenon. You can look at paintings, sculptures, films, TV shows, novels, poems. Any cultural phenomenon can be explored and analyzed through these particular lenses. So queer theory looks at the ways in which, let me just make some space for myself here. It's the ways in which explores the ways in which traditional models of gender and sexuality are either represented or transgressed. And other words that we can use here: transgressed, challenged, subverted. Okay. So here's what we mean by traditional representation or traditional models of gender and sexuality. Well, the traditional models of gender and sexuality have, men, biological males identifying as biological males and biological women identifying as biological women, and these biological entities being biologically attracted to each other to create the family. And as far as sexuality goes, it's assumed that we are attracted to members of the opposite sex. Now, of course, we know that that's not true. There are people who have same-sex attractions, and that is what it is. The problem, though, when it comes to this analysis is that we have to be looking at whether or not these representations of gender or sexual non-conforming people is, well, generous or cruel, or how is it being shown? And what conclusions do we draw about a particular society's attitude about gender and sexuality? A good example of this is a play that I'm studying with a student in an independent study. Student wanted to do with me a survey of queer theater. And you might not think that there would be a lot there, especially before this time period, but there really is. One play that we're looking at now is called Edward II by Christopher Marlowe, and it's about a historical English king that was passionately in love with his best friend, a man named Gaveston. And Gaveston is a commoner, basically. He's not even royalty, but he and the king have become the best of friends, and a relationship that is even transcendent of the king's relationship with his wife. The play has the nobles of the English court completely up in arms about the elevation of this guy over them, and the fact that the king is constantly sporting, is the term that they use, frolicking with his minion, as they describe him. And ultimately, the character of Mortimer leads a coup against the king, and the king ends up being deposed. Gaveston is killed, the king is imprisoned, and then they go so far as to murder the king himself. Scholars of the 19th century, squeamish about the homosexual theme in the play, tended to kind of push that aside and look at it from the perspective of court jealousies, which are present. It's part of why they hate Gaveston, the nobles hate Gaveston, but even more so because of this relationship that he has with the king. And Marlowe, who himself was gay and who died at the age of 28 in a bar fight, 29, I think he's in the 29 club, or the 27 club. He died in a bar fight, young, but one of his quotes, his famous sayings is, "I love not them that love not boys and cigarettes," said Marlowe. And so this play is as queer as can be in terms of the representation of the king's sexuality and his relationship with Gaveston. Gaveston himself is represented as overtly effeminate, and their physical attraction to each other is not hidden in the play. This makes it very uncomfortable for Elizabethan audiences to watch. But from another queer perspective, Elizabethan audiences are also watching men romancing boys in dresses. The man playing Romeo, or the young man playing Romeo, is romancing probably a younger man in a dress. And the audience knows that this is not a woman, that this is a man in a dress. And yet the love scene, passionately played, starts to raise some questions now about what's going on with these actors, and whether or not same-sex attraction now is seeping in to the Elizabethan theater as a result of audiences watching boys effectively play women, and play them well. And play them so well that you find yourself believing or forgetting that you're watching two men engaged in a romantic encounter, you see. And so as you look at this, it starts to, queer theory looks at how this troubles the audience now. And we have from the Elizabethan period documents that are called anti-theatrical polemics. It's a fancy way of saying theater is bad and you shouldn't go to it. And one of the reasons that theater was bad and you shouldn't go to it was because you were seeing what were essentially same-sex relationships going on the stage. Even though you were watching a man in character romancing a boy in a dress, it's still two men. And so the Lord Mayor of London, in one of his famous complaints, the Lord Mayor at the time of London, I think it's in the early 1600s, late 1500s, I have to check my sources, but he writes this letter to the Lord Chamberlain, who was the advisor to the king, or the queen in this case, Queen Elizabeth. And in it, he says that the theater is a cesspool of vices. It demonstrates all kinds of bad behavior on stage. The plays that people seem to like the best are the plays in which people are killing each other, cheating on each other, lying to each other, deceiving each other. And the play is not, teaching any good values, except maybe at the end, if a villain gets a comeuppance, the audience sort of dismisses that as being, well, this is what they had to do. But he complains that the audience is taking delight in this. And in addition, the theater, because it's open at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Elizabethan England, it's distracting people from their work. It's causing the apprentices to want to cross the river to the the south side of the Thames to go into what was called the Liberty, which was not under the control of the king or anybody else. It was a liberty, so the bars were there, the prostitution brothels were there, and the theaters were there. So you spend a lot of time in the liberties, and you're also being exposed to a lot of other vices as well. The Lord Mayor even went so far as to say that theater doth encourageth sodomy. Okay. I have been around the theater a lot myself in my life. It never occurred to me, but I saw this in the history, and the argument was that the theater is inciting these unnatural passions in people and causing them to want to engage in sodomitic acts. So queer theory is looking at the history of the theater and the plays themselves from this perspective. There are plays in which that take this issue on directly, like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, a great movie, by the way, if you ever wanted to watch it, with Paul Newman as Brick and Elizabeth Taylor as Maggie the cat. And Brick is a washed-up former athlete who, at the time of the play, has broken his ankle because while drunk, he was trying to clear the high hurdles in his old high school, trying to relive his glory days when he was an athlete. The problem is that he's a fall-down drunk. He will not have relations with his wife. If they don't have children, then they don't get the plantation. And the question now in the play is what happened between Brick and his best friend Skipper, who we know was in love with Brick, who killed himself because of it, and because of this, Brick blames his wife Maggie and has completely shut him out. So the big question in the play becomes, what is Brick's sexuality? What's Brick's deal? Is he really gay and he's just deeply, deeply closeted? Or is it what he said it was? It was just a beautiful friendship that he had, not too different from the relationship between Edward and Gaveston. So this is, and there's so much I could say. I could talk about this for 2 hours, but I'm not. I'm going to close it up here because now you have as much as you need to know to do the quiz on Friday. So if you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. If I think of anything new that I needed to tell you or forgot about, I'll let you know that also. I'll post like maybe a follow-up lecture. But you have what you need for now. Also, be on the lookout for instructions for the midterm. Those are coming. And you'll understand the instructions for the midterm better when we get to next week and we start talking about genres of theater and I start to turn you guys over into to the reading of plays and performing, writing some kind of essay or analysis of it for the midterm. So again, any questions, let me know. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture.